All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, I'm Amy O'Hara. I am the president of the Association of Public Data Users, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I am here with Megan Brown, who is currently a PhD student in Information and Scientific Computing at the University of Michigan. Her research is centered on the online information ecosystem. She's studying political bias in algorithmic systems, the effect of platform governance and moderation policies on the spread of political content, and research infrastructure to support computational social science. Formerly, she was the senior research engineer at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, where she had collected and maintained large-scale collections of social media and digital trace data for social science research. She's going to present and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A today. So as we get started, please type your questions in the chat as we go along. Megan, thank you so much for joining us. And I saw that you published a paper called Web Scraping for Research, Legal, Ethical, Institutional, and Scientific Considerations. That caught my eye. Can you tell our audience about your research?
Yes, so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Oh no, hold on. I have to do a permissions thing, it looks like. Okay. Try that again. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Alrighty. Thank you for having me. I'll be doing like 15-ish minutes on what we talk about in our paper, which as you said is called Web Scraping for Research, Legal, Ethical, Institutional, and Scientific Considerations. This is a paper that I worked on with Andrew Gruen, Gabe Maldoff, Saul Messing, Z. Sanderson, and Michael Zimmer. Quick disclaimer at the top, I'm not a lawyer and this does not constitute legal advice. And just a general disclaimer on the legal aspects that we're sharing here is that legal analysis is based on the current legal situation in the United States at the time that the paper was written. It was published in November, December of last year, so it's up to date as of that point. Laws are subject to change, and we encourage researchers to consult with qualified legal professionals when engaging in scraping. The ethical and scientific considerations should generally apply. Institutional considerations may apply depending on how sort of close your institution looks like an American university. And so just disclaimer on the scope here. But why did we write this paper? Many APIs that we use for research have closed, so things like Twitter's API, the sunsetting of CrowdTangle to study Facebook and Instagram, and this means that it is now a lot more difficult for researchers to access internet data because the official sources through which researchers access that data have closed and are no longer accessible. So what we think this means is that researchers no longer can access data through these public channels, where you are sort of entering into an agreement with the platform and accessing data in a way that the platform says you can, which means that we are expecting an increase in the use of scraped data for research, since it's one of the few economical or possible methods left to collect research data at scale. And I use the word economical here as well because some platforms, even though they have shut down their academic APIs, have implemented new programs that are just astronomical cost. Like Twitter's, for example, costs thousands of dollars a month, which for most researchers is just not a feasible price for them to pay. And so because of this sort of constellation of events, we're expecting that a lot more researchers will be using scraping to collect their data. And this method of data collection introduces some new, some similar legal, ethical, institutional, and scientific challenges that we need to contend with to make sure that we're doing research work where we are minimizing the risk to the researchers and the research participants while maximizing the potential benefit of the research that we're producing. And so that's our broad goal is providing researchers with a guide for navigating web scraping in their research. As the title suggests, we're strictly considering the legal, ethical, institutional, and scientific considerations. We've left some of the more technical considerations about how this actually happens or methods for actually web scraping to other research projects. But to start out, we've sort of taken and broken down these categories into four broad categories: the legal, ethical, institutional, and scientific considerations. Legally, this landscape is really complex. Scraping implicates many overlapping areas of law and regulation. So it's not just like there's one law that says how we can scrape or cannot scrape. And different jurisdictions, laws may apply in different situations, and this depends on where the researcher is located, where the data collection is happening, who the data subjects are, and what jurisdictions have governance over those data subjects. Um, and so there's a large patchwork of legal issues that researchers need to consider. Under ethical considerations, we think that a lot of the same considerations around ethical research access from things like the AOIR guidelines or the Pervade Project still apply, but scraping does introduce some additional ethical concerns throughout the research lifecycle, which I'll get into in a minute. Institutionally, researchers primarily engage with organizations like IRBs, offices of general counsel, and research computing teams. And the thing that we mainly highlight in this paper is that institutionally, the IRB's responsibility is to ensure that research aligns with legal, ethical, and institutional policies, but mostly around laws that govern research and research subjects. So not necessarily the sort of full consideration of ethics beyond what we would typically say is allowed by the IRB. And also offices of general counsel, while they can provide advice on these sorts of things, they do represent the university and not you, the researcher, which can also introduce some challenges when you, the researcher, are the one that may be navigating these legal uh, rough waters. And scientifically speaking, and much of this did exist in the world of APIs, but still exists currently. Um, One of the biggest challenges with scraping data is thinking about poor sampling frames, missing data, temporal instability, and the construct validity of the data that we're collecting. Because oftentimes when we're scraping, we don't actually know the underlying distribution that we're scraping from. We don't know when platforms will change their formats and make it much more difficult to scrape data. And so these can threaten inferences that we can make with scraped data. And so we also are going to talk through some of the scientific considerations. So legally speaking, as I discussed a little bit earlier, there's a very wide patchwork of laws that apply in the scraping context. The first is contract law. And this is because when a person is scraping data, they've typically made an account with the platform, or there are terms and conditions of the platform that simply accessing the platform means you agree to some level of terms of service. And these are considered user contracts. And these invoke contract law essentially. And so if you're scraping a platform where you have an account with them, or a platform where the terms of service says that once you access the platform, you have now agreed to the terms of service, then you're invoking contract law. And oftentimes in these terms of service, there's regulations around who can scrape or what they can scrape. And scraping for research often violates these regulations. And so that can violate contract law. There's also intellectual property law considerations, especially when the content being scraped is subject to copyright. So this is often more like media type content rather than what we see from like social media platforms, for example. But that can be an issue depending on what's being scraped. It also implicates computer hacking law because computer hacking law in the US is pretty vague and from the 90s and hasn't really been updated much since then. And this is essentially when the person scraping is exceeding authorized access. And because of what I mentioned before about the terms and conditions, because these typically prohibit activities like scraping, then this can be interpreted as exceeding authorized access, more or less. And then one of the biggest and I would say most complex areas to navigate are the privacy and data protection laws, because often we are collecting information about people, and those are protected by data protection laws, including laws like GDPR in the EU. And there's several state level laws in the United States, like the California Consumer Privacy Act. And these are things that researchers generally have to think about when they're collecting data and storing data. And so the recommendations we make for researchers is that first, all of this analysis is case by case, depending on how you're collecting the data, the terms of applicable contracts, the nature of the data being scraped, and the affected jurisdictions. And as I mentioned before, the affected jurisdictions are not just where you, the researcher, are sitting. They also include if you're scraping data about a person in the EU, then GDPR may apply in a given case. Also, websites and services that are accessible to the general public without requiring an authentication email entail significantly lower legal risk. This is not to say that it contains no legal risk, but generally speaking, data that's considered rather public or easily accessible is going to have less legal risk than something like a more private group, or a group that's harder to access. And lastly, data protection impact assessments can be used to identify the appropriate safeguards for the privacy and security of the data that you're collecting. And these are tools that basically allow you to think about what the data you're collecting is, what level of identifiability it has, what jurisdictions the data subjects may be in that you're required to go by specific privacy laws or abide by those specific laws. Um, and then they sort of allow you to think of this systematic way to come up with a data security plan or technical safeguards like password protection, storing things on external hard drives that are password protected, or sort of virtual data enclaves and tools like that, depending on the sensitivity of the data. The second area is ethical considerations, and the biggest consideration here is that users are most likely not aware that their data can be or is being used for research, and they might not want to be included in research even though their data is public. Scraped data can also be used downstream for of the research in ways that cause harm, so we need to be thinking about what are the additional uses beyond this specific research project that if I shared this data or used it for other things, that what are the downstream consequences of that? How could that negatively impact the users that I've collected this data on? And lastly, because scraping is generally a much faster and much more automated way to access data on platforms. Scraping can impose burdens on websites or interrupt their services because we're sending so many requests to that particular service that it then has trouble processing those requests and may degrade performance for other users or the entire platform. And so those are things that we need to think about as we're scraping, how we go about it. So our broadest recommendation is based on the AOIR ethics guidelines and the Pervade Research Project, which is that we should remember the humans in the data and practice critical reflexivity. So thinking about what's the contextual integrity of the data, how might users whose data is exposed in this way feel about that. And we also need to acknowledge that publicness is not the only factor that can determine whether research is ethical. So we shouldn't just say like, well, it's public, so we collected it. We should think more about what's the potential harm to the participants? What is the potential benefit from analyzing a specific data set? And lastly, we should be going beyond what IRB suggests. Like I said before, they're mainly designed to ensure that research complies with federal laws about research safety. And internet research as found data a lot of those laws aren't really applicable. And so going beyond what IRBs govern as ethical or not ethical, and finding resources about how specifically to consider this kind of data, given that it's sort of in a niche no man's land in terms of how we should think about using it. The third category here is institutional, and these are largely university-based institutions, but these or the ones that researchers are mostly engaging with are institutional review boards, offices of general counsel, and research information technology units. IRBs ensure that research complies with the ethical, legal, and institutional policies. And these don't always mean that they're ensuring that research adheres to some set of ethical guidelines, but just those that are sort of legally mandated as a part of things like the common rule. There's also offices of general counsel, which, as I mentioned before, they provide legal advice to the university and often can provide information to you, the researcher. However, they represent the university, so at the end of the day, their goal is to ensure that the university um, has legal protection in any given case, and they don't represent you, the researcher. And lastly, our research information technology units. If you're collecting data through your own university's research IT system, they can provide support on key data management questions like where should data be stored so that it's safeguarded? What are the protections that are possible for the data to sort of mitigate it being shared where it shouldn't be or mitigate misuse? And so our recommendations for the institutional factors are to engage with your IRB, OGC, and research IT early and often to identify approaches that can mitigate risks to both you, the researcher, and the risks to the research subjects. And external organizations can provide valuable expertise. This includes organizations like the Knight First Amendment Institute, which can provide advice specifically for researchers that are studying online communication and the challenges of collecting those sorts of data. Um, Other professional organizations may be helpful about the technical challenges with scraping. Those might include archival organizations like ICPSR that have expertise in how to safely store and handle these data sets. And lastly, are the scientific considerations. There's so many beyond just what we discuss in the paper, but the biggest ones that we were considering are poor sampling frames, missing data, poor construct validity, and unreproducible research. Poor sampling frames are mainly a source of the fact that it's often impossible to assess the representativeness of the sample. If we're searching a platform for posts containing a particular keyword, we have no way of knowing whether what the platform is returning is the full set of posts that contain that keyword, the most popular set of posts containing that keyword, whether there's time waiting or anything like that. And that can cause issues for what sort of inferences we're trying to draw from the data. There's also missing data, and that's because content can be missing in unmeasurable ways because of how websites serve content to users. So that includes things like I just mentioned, like we don't know exactly how they're ranking or weighting content that they show you, but also things like content that gets deleted because of content moderation. If we're trying to understand things like misinformation, we just may not be able to find it because platforms moderate it. There's also poor construct validity, and this is because we might be wanting to measure something like what people are seeing on the platform, but what we're able to collect is just the list of people they follow. So if someone has like an algorithmic feed, we may not be able they may be getting a lot of content in their feed that comes from outside of directly the people they follow. And so then we have this mismatch between the thing we want to measure, which is what people are exposed to, and the thing we have, which is the list of posts by the people they follow. And the last bit is unreproducible research. And that's because content on the website can be removed or changed. And also, pipelines can become unreproducible when, let's say, Twitter decides to do a totally new user experience. Now, our web scraping tool is broken, and we can no longer reproduce the research data set that we collected, or we have to come up with a whole new pipeline to collect this kind of data. And so our recommendations for this broadly are first considering whether the question at hand can be researched or answered using scraping. So if there's so many uncertainties around what data you're getting, what the validity of that data is, you may want to step back and consider whether this is an appropriate method to collect the data you need for your research. We also recommend developing deliberate sampling strategies rather than relying on convenience samples. So defining a specific population of interest that might be populations like politicians or journalists or bureaucrats or sports teams, just depending on your research question. And those are often much easier to define and create a sample that has coverage that you know what the coverage is rather than just hoping that you get a reasonable sample back when searching for things like keywords. We also want researchers to make sure that they're clearly caveating claims based on scrape data, so acknowledging where data might be biased or missing because of the method that they collected the data. And lastly, conducting tests where possible to refine the data pipeline, correct any errors, and identify sources of missing data so that all of these things can be reported in analyses to ensure that we know like what we might be missing or how this data collection source is biasing our inferences. And so that's all I have. The QR code, I believe, is to the paper. Um, but thank you all, and I look forward to your questions.
That was great. Uh, please put your questions in the Q&A. Um, as some of those come in, I'm going to get started by asking you a question. In your paper, you talk a lot about the ethics of web scraping
Mhm.
and whether the existing ethical standards are sufficient or insufficient right now. Could you talk a little bit about the tension between informed consent and found data, like these organic data that people can just harvest?
Yeah, so I think this is not necessarily new to web scraping, but is definitely, I think, exacerbated when we're doing web scraping. And the core issue here, I think, is that previously in social science, we sort of had this expectation that when we are using data in research from individuals, that we are um, getting informed consent from them. So they've read a form that goes over the risks and benefits of the research, and they've agreed for their data to be used in research, whether that's a survey, medical specimens, or other types of information that we may know about them. And now that we have all of this internet data where we can just go onto Reddit or Twitter and collect just people's public thoughts and use that to understand what's going on online, this means that we're now collecting data from people that they didn't necessarily consent to. And so there's some really interesting research by Casey Fiesler, which shows that often people are not aware that their data can be used in research, and people also are often fairly uncomfortable with that. And so I think there's a tension between like it is really important for us to understand what's happening online, how are our online environments shaping digital life, political life, our social lives, and the fact that this is found data that people may not be aware is being used in research. And so I think there are guidelines like the AOIR ethical guidelines that still apply. There's also research by the
Can you
Pervade
tell
group.
them what AOIR is?
Oh, yes, this is the Association of Internet Researchers ethical guidelines.
Great.
And these were developed by a team, including Michael Zimmer, who's an author on this paper, but and it's more of a set of guidelines rather than a specific checklist or a thing that says this is ethical or this is unethical, because the thing with internet research is that it often depends. And so I think these guidelines tend to give researchers a set of things to think through rather than saying like, yes, this is good or no, it isn't. Um, there's also research out of the Pervade group at the University of Maryland that has published some good work in thinking about how we can ethically handle this data while making sure that we can also learn things that are important for us to know about the impact of platforms on society.
That's great. Thanks. We have some questions coming in. The first one is, could you speak a bit to how you think of the differences between individual scraped content and bulk scrape data in terms of how that could change potentially the ethical, legal, and privacy categorization?
Yeah, so I think with a lot of scrape data, part of it depends on like how you gained access to particular data. So accounts, if you're gaining access to an account that's private, for example, because like you're friends with someone, you followed them, and now you have access to that. That's a different category than like Donald Trump's public account. And so I think when we're thinking about like what does it mean to study an individual versus aggregations, a lot of that depends on sort of the publicness of the person, and also just I think the sensitivity of the things that they're talking about. And so I think when we're doing these sort of like individual accounts, I would generally argue that it's appropriate to look at things like politicians or really large companies and what they're talking about online and talk about them as individuals. Whereas I think when we're looking at more day-to-day regular people that are maybe using pseudonymous accounts or just don't have this expectation that thousands of people may see their posts because they only have a couple hundred followers that are generally people they know. I think those tend to fall much more so into the kinds of guidelines that we use for things like survey research, where we try to aggregate up to a certain point to make sure that individuals in the data can't be re-identified.
Great, thanks. Another question. Can you give a few examples of platforms researchers are scraping data from?
Yeah, I think I don't know that there's a platform under the sun that researchers aren't scraping from. I think some of the more famous projects are things like the PushShift archive, which was largely collecting Reddit data.
Mhm.
Um, I know that there are efforts that researchers are working on to scrape platforms like Blue Sky, which has an open protocol. So it's generally most of the data there is public. And so I do think most platforms are being scraped. I think there's sort of bigger and smaller consequences for different platforms. Like I know that Twitter now has parts of their terms of service which base the sort of penalty for scraping on a like I think it's a per million tweet basis or something like that, where you have to pay a certain amount of money per million tweets that you scrape if Twitter does catch you and decide to enforce that. And so I think all platforms are probably being scraped. I think there's just a varying level of the extent to which people are making that public, depending on the risk.
Got it. Thanks. Another question. How do you think about using opinion articles in a newspaper versus opinions published on a social media platform?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the sort of contextual integrity question, which is that when an individual is publishing an opinion article in a newspaper, I think that is generally like something that they are saying, like, I am writing this in a newspaper because I want people to read this opinion and think about it, and I want this opinion to influence things. Whereas someone posting an opinion on social media might just be venting, they might be making a joke. They probably think that only the like six people that they regularly engage with on social media are reading it. And so I think generally, like things like opinion articles probably have a lower expectation of privacy than an individual posting opinions. I would also say the other thing to think about with any kind of like news article or opinion article is that these often are subject to copyright. And so there are some intellectual property implications there, depending on your research use case, um, that you would need to consider beyond the ethical dimension.
Yeah. It's related to another question, which is how the situation changes if the person is actually an influencer or claims to be an influencer.
Yeah, I think this is just a really tricky question because I think there are cases that we can all agree on of like a member of Congress is a very public figure. This is a person with a Wikipedia page. This is a person that is making laws for the whole country. And so what they say online is really important. And then there are sort of individuals in like small and niche communities that we maybe um, that have a higher expectation of privacy. And I think that there's like a really long range in the middle that is difficult. And so I think when we're deciding to do research on these groups, one of the things to think about is what is the expectation that these people have of like what their data will be used for, or how many people will see their data. And I think influencers, given that their goal is to influence people, they are posting opinions, maybe fall closer into the sort of like journalist or like news opinion category, than maybe a sort of like lay person just posting pictures of like, here's my niece's birthday party. Um, that said, I do think it would just also depend on like what is the general reach of this person. At what level are we aggregating over the behavior of a bunch of influencers versus individual influencers, that sort of thing.
Knowing that these platforms now have a lot of content provided by bots, how
Mhm.
do you convince researchers that they have to behave more responsibly than a bot?
Um, I think, I do think that is one of the challenging things is that the data is public and a lot of people are using it for a lot of different purposes. Companies are scraping this data to train AI systems
Yep.
um, in ways that like no one in the data can really revoke consent for.
Mhm.
I think as researchers, we have to think about the fact that like when we are doing human subjects research, and this is human subjects research, even though an IRB might not rule it as such because we're not engaging directly with them, we do owe a certain amount to the people in the data. And often when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about things like beneficence,
Mhm.
mitigating harm. And so even though like these AI systems and these private companies are doing this, like we as researchers do have these sort of long held ethical norms about how we're engaging with human research subjects. And I think, just we shouldn't be the lowest common denominator on the ethics front in how we're using this data.
Is it similar to the way that, it's kind of like being observed in public?
Hmm.
If you have posted things that are not private to your own little friend group, um, how does the way that you talk about this with your categories, how is that parallel to the way that we're being surveilled by
Hmm.
cameras, like just being observed in public, but then someone captures your image, or people wearing the glasses, or
Yeah, I
I,
mean, I think one of the ways that I've often thought about this is just that, like, if you're in Washington Square Park and you're just hanging out and someone observes you doing something, they're free to go to their friends and be like, I saw someone doing this in Washington Square Park, or even a researcher doing an observation of like what people do in the park every day, would be, I think, within reason to say, like, I went to the park on this day and here's what I observed. I think where internet data is a little bit different from this is that not only are you observing like what people are saying or how they're behaving, but often you have a lot more information about them. Like you can access their friend networks. Often they're using their names. You may be able to know from other things they do where they're employed or other sort of personal information about them that they may not expect to all sort of be in one place or together or think about that when they're producing content. And so I think when we are doing this kind of research, we sort of have to think beyond the we're observing people in public and what are the things that we know about people that are sort of separate from this observation that we maybe don't want to share with the public because like someone would be well within their right to say, I saw a woman in the park reading a book, and it would be really strange if they were like, I saw Megan Brown in the park reading a book at this time, and this is what the book was, and here's where she works, and here's she walked this way to go home. I think is pretty different, and so I think some of this speaks to, and I didn't speak to this in the talk, but one of the other things that we talk about is data minimization as a potential practice for mitigating some of the possible harms. And we collect all this data; it has a lot of information in it. Um, like I said, things like where they live, maybe where they work. And we can also strip that information out if it's just not pertinent to the study that we're doing. And so I think thinking about data minimization and what we actually need to keep for the study purposes, what we can strip out without losing sort of the meaning of the study or the meaning of the content that we're studying, is an important step just for mitigating these kinds of harms.
thanks. So you've focused a lot on how university
Mhm.
researchers are going to be working in this space, but some of the APDU audience is not at a university. If someone's at a nonprofit or some other organization that might not have an OGC or an IRB, what do you recommend?
So I think even at least on the ethics guidelines, so more related to the IRB point, I do still think, even if it's not a university research environment, ethics guidelines like those from AOIR or Pervade, I think are still very relevant. Because I think often when we're doing these kinds of analyses, whether we're at a nonprofit institution or a university, um, we are trying to do some sort of public good analysis, whatever that is. Um, I think on the legal front, I would say I'm less familiar with the kinds of resources that are available there, um, just because I don't work in that area.
Got it. Thanks. Well, I don't see any other questions. Oh wait, did I miss one? Sorry. Here's one. Are there research questions where it would make sense to offer some level of PII about the individual? You spoke about generally wanting to aggregate to a critical N, say greater than 10 or greater than 30. In most cases, they can't think of a reason to capture the individual handles or identities of people who are posting, but when would that information be pertinent?
Yeah, I think I mean one of the easiest answers is just people that are so obscenely public that it doesn't make sense to anonymize, and that can include anything from members of Congress to celebrities to I know we discussed influencers a little bit earlier, depending on the influencer. And I think those individuals both have less of an expectation of privacy, but often are exerting enormous influence and power over either our social lives, civic lives, what's happening in politics. And so I think in those cases, it's a really easy thing to say, like, I don't think we need to anonymize members of Congress. Like it, I don't think it makes sense. Often we do care about individual level data about how these people are behaving, and they don't really have the same expectation of privacy that like you or I would. Um, I think there are other cases where it does get really tricky. Like one of the things that I have studied before, will plan on continuing to study is just generally how harmful content spreads online. Often the way that harmful content spreads online is through ordinary users. And so, you know, I think it is really important to analyze how this content spreads, what are the types of users that spread it. But I think it's difficult to determine when it's appropriate to say, like, oh, we should point out this particular user versus aggregate over the analyses. I don't know exactly where that falls. I think the unfortunate answer is it really depends on the research question and the user in question. Um, one set of guidelines that I do think have been recently published, but if not, will be soon published, are the Knight Georgetown Institute has a new guide on public data. And so I think that is also one area or another set of guidelines in addition to the like AOIR guidelines or Pervade that can help researchers assess when it's appropriate to share individual data or not.
Great, thank you. Another question. It's interesting to consider what it means for a local government that is subject to open data laws to scrape, store, and use the data. They may not be using the data for decision. They may be using the data for decision making, not for published research.
Yeah,
Any
that
thoughts
is
on
really
kind of the
interesting.
operational use?
So I actually haven't really thought of that. I do know there's, you know, sort of a lot of government data available. Generally speaking, I do think transparency laws are good. Um, the I would say like most of the data I'm familiar with are things like census data, which is released in aggregated ways. Or if you are accessing individual level census data, you just show up to like an air-gapped room at a university in whatever state you reside in, which can be really intense. And I don't know that I would say that sort of scraped internet data sort of warrants that same level of risk. But I do think when it is the kind of data that's influencing public decisions, and these include data all the way from maybe your local government collected some tweets about a local park to try and figure out like what do we need to do to better service this local park. But it also includes things like there are sort of online government forums where people do post comments. That's anything from the FCC to, again, like a local parks department might have these. And I think those data are also sort of really important to study. And I think it is really important for governments to say, like, we've made this data back decision, here's the data. Whether or not that data sort of ought to be public or have like this sort of really long-term durability, especially if people are deleting posts or things like that. I do think it's a tricky question.
Yeah, I could imagine that coming up because there are some of the areas around Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
that did an absolutely abysmal job removing snow when we had
Oh
the
yeah.
big storm. And so I could imagine that that information kind of being harvested and used to inform at least where some services were less available in certain areas.
Yeah, and I do think a lot, at least on the legal analysis side, a lot of our legal analysis is based on this sort of like not-for-profit use case or this like non-competitive use case.
Mhm.
And so I gonna again give the I'm not a lawyer disclaimer. But my guess is that that would sort of be of a similar use case, where it's like this is not a for-profit company attempting to sell snow ice products
Yeah.
or salt products or something like that. But I do think um, yeah, that is really interesting to think about, and I had not thought about it before. So.
All right. Well, I got another question. Being respectful of the source sites, do you have any recommendations regarding the run times and run dates for scraping? Is after business hours better?
Um, I think that really depends a lot on the scale of the website. Probably in most cases, after business hours, it's going to be a little bit lower. For a website like Facebook, where they have users all over the world, I
Mhm.
don't know that there's going to be any particular hour that could be considered not business hours. That said, I think it's less of a like what time of day are you doing it thing and more of a question of like how many requests are you
Mhm.
sending per hour or per minute. Oftentimes platforms will sort of rate limit you and prevent you from sending more requests to them or processing more requests from your IP address, just given um, they may be having difficulty processing that many requests. Um, so I think one of the big things is just if you are getting these sort of errors where you've sent too many requests,
Mhm.
slow down. I think is the sort of easiest bet. And then I think the other sort of thing to consider is just like what is the overall load of the website? I think we can generally expect something like Facebook or Twitter to have a really high load. If you're scraping sort of small business pages, they might have a much lower expected load. And so I think those would be the two things that I would mainly consider is just like generally how many requests are they probably getting and processing at any given time, and then like how many requests am I trying to make per minute? And both of those are things that can easily be slowed down. And so I think, when in doubt, slow down as much as you can. Um, if you're slowing down to the point that it'll take you like 63 years to collect the data, then maybe that's a problem. Um, but yeah, those would be the main sort of technical things that I would think about.
Great, thanks. Another question. How do you account for changes in algorithms?
Yeah, that one's really tricky. I think the unfortunate answer is you don't. Or at least there's no way for us to know when platforms are tweaking these kinds of algorithms, or when they do change the algorithm, how they changed it, except in the case where like Twitter released like, here's our whole algorithm, and we find the flag that says like, if it's Elon Musk, amplify it. I think those are sort of really rare cases, and I don't think Twitter has updated that at all recently, and I'm sure they've made many other changes. I think the responsible thing we can do as researchers is just say like, hey, we did our best to collect this particular sample. Here's our assumptions of this sample. Here's what might be missing, and using those to caveat our work. There are some really interesting research projects that do aim to audit algorithms specifically. I've done a couple of them myself on YouTube, but there's also projects that do this on like Twitter and Facebook. Um, and I think those I think can be really good guides if you are interested in understanding specifically how these algorithms are working. But if you're just trying to collect data and trying to account for the fact that algorithms do change, unfortunately, I don't think we can account for that, but we can acknowledge it and say how it might change our results.
Okay, thanks. I like this next question, knowing who some of your co-authors were.
Mhm.
Can you talk a bit about the ethical, legal, institutional standards for research done within the companies who own the platforms where the content is created? And I say that because I know that a couple of
Mhm.
those guys were at Facebook when it was called Facebook.
Yes. Yeah, so I think you know, one of the new sort of models of doing this are industry academic partnerships.
Mhm.
And that includes both sort of academics working within the industry company itself, but also academics partnering with industry researchers to do this kind of work. Like there's a sort of famous series of papers about Meta in I want to say the 2020 elections, but all the papers came out like in the last couple of years because academic publishing is slow. Um, but I do think oftentimes one of the things that sort of differentiates companies doing these projects from, researchers is that researchers are beholden to things like IRB and informed consent. And when you're at a company, you can just run an A/B test. And so I do think, some of these sort of internal research units they do have academics in them. They follow a lot of these practices. I know for the Meta 2020 projects, they did actually have an external IRB application, if I'm remembering correctly. And so I do think there is an effort within these groups to uphold sort of ethical standards. I think there is this issue of like there are these really great projects that do these industry academic partnerships, and we learn a lot about the platforms and how they function. But that I imagine is just a drop in the bucket of all the different sort of experiments that platforms may run on users, or just the analyses they run on users themselves. That it's just difficult to know from the outside like what the results of those are. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I think doing this sort of public from the outside work is important, is because like there are certainly a lot of things that the platforms know about themselves from analyses that their researchers have done within the platforms. And I think, often those are of interest to the public and how they might engage with the platform or let their children engage with the platform, as we learn from things like the Facebook files.
Yeah. I just think that there's a whole different set of incentives for them
Yeah.
to make that information widely known.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Say that you have scraped data and you want to share the data for reasons of being transparent and
Mhm.
promoting replication. What are some ways that you could publicly share scraped data in an ethical fashion?
Um, and this is going to be a shameless plug for the institution I work for, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan. ICPSR at the University of Michigan does a bunch of data archiving for social science projects generally, but also has a social media archive specifically. And so this is something that we're thinking a lot about. I think, in some cases, I feel totally okay just dropping a CSV on Harvard Dataverse or wherever. And I think the case I keep coming back to are like members of Congress, because that is a specific project that I'm working on. But things like that, I would say like I don't really have qualms sharing a CSV of like Donald Trump's Twitter post. I think when we are coming to those sort of more sensitive user data sets, where we may not want to publish just here's the permanent record of what this account said, even if they may have deleted their data, may not want that being used in research, are things like archival organizations, which can do more like access control than what's possible on a website like Harvard Dataverse or Zenodo, um, or just a Google Drive. And so I think those sort of access control permissions or just having a few more safeguards or friction between anyone who might want to use the data and the data itself, I think can be helpful for managing those issues.
So, so is there anything that we haven't asked yet that you really want participants to know?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, One thing that I had not mentioned, because it also made it into the appendix of the paper, not the main part of the paper, because word limits exist, is that one of the other things that can be really different for how you're accessing data, are there's sort of just like regular scraping, where you're just pointing your computer at a browser or pointing whatever programming language you're using at a URL and collect this information, parsing it into whatever format you want. There's also the sort of like undocumented API version, which is saying like most platforms use APIs to provide content to users. We can also reconstruct URLs to these APIs and bring them back. And then another one that I think is becoming increasingly popular, in part just due to the platforms closing down their APIs, are these browser plugins where you enroll a panel of survey respondents into into a research study, and then they install a browser plugin that may let you access their browsing history, but also what they're seeing on the page. And I think that that can be a good method for studying like what people are consuming online. Um, those do have sort of additional implications for the privacy of the people in the data. Like people are often accessing like their health websites or their bank accounts that we may not want to collect. There's also issues like when you're browsing on your Twitter account, you may think it's fine if researchers see what you see from like the New York Times or other very public accounts, and less fine for like your friend whose private account that you follow. So I think there's a lot more sort of technical challenges with that. But those those I think are promising methods for additional sort of scraping research. And then the other thing I'd mention is that those also have different legal implications. So like Facebook sort of famously sent a cease and desist to some researchers at NYU for setting up a data collection like this to collect Facebook ads. And so I think one of the additional things beyond just are you scraping, what's the data you're scraping, is what's the method you're scraping. And so I would definitely encourage people to think about that when they're setting up these kinds of data collections.
That's great. Thanks. I want to thank you for being with us today. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. Makes me really think about how chaotic it would be if I had that plugin and people saw all the things that I browse to. For anyone that wants to go back and rewatch this or share it with colleagues, a recording will be posted to APDU's YouTube channel, and that's going to be in the chat if you want to see that. And if you would like to see more events like this, please let us know. You could send an email to us at info@apdu.org. And if you're not already receiving our newsletter to get announcements like this, please click the link in the chat. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially you, Megan. This was great.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was fantastic.